In this video we're going to create ourselves a directive. I'm going to be building a version of the ng-click directive, but if you need to look up the directive documentation, then head to this URL on the Angular website and it will give you a really good in-depth guide to creating directives, and also have a search around the internet. So here I have the beginnings of our directive app. I've got a controller called example, and I have a button here with a message in it that's defined in our controller down here, and then a function called click. And I've used the ng-click directive to say that when this button is clicked, we are going to show an alert box with the scope message. So I can now click that button and we get a little message. What we're going to do is re-implement the ng-click directive to just be called click. And you can see as I change this, I click the button and now nothing is happening. So we need to create our own directive. To do so, we use the same dot syntax we've learnt from filters and controllers. So I'll say dot directive, and I'll give it a name. The name's quite important. In this case, it's just going to be called click, but I'll go into some other examples later, and you can watch the previous video for a recap of all the different possible names of directives. Then, again, we pass it a function, and from the function, instead of returning another function, we're going to return an object. The object we return contains the properties of the directive that we're creating. And Angular has a set of properties we can define that you can find on the website right about here that shows all the different things that we can set in this object in order to set up our directive. To start with, we're only going to use two of them: restrict and link. Restrict is what tells Angular how we can use the directive. There's a whole range of different options, and I'll show you them down on this page. You can see we can restrict our directive to the element name, an attribute, or inside a comment. In this case, I'm going to restrict us to the attribute, because you can see here I've used click as an attribute of a button. The next thing we're going to do is pass a link function. The link function gets past each element instance on which Angular finds our directive. It's given the scope the element lived in, the element itself wrapped in a sort of light version of jQuery, and the attributes of the object. So you can see we've got three parameters: scope, element, and attributes, or attrs. Inside here we carry out all the behavior of our directive. In this case we're just building quite a simple one, and all we need to really do is attach a click handler to the element and then use either scope or attributes to run the JavaScript contained in the click directive. Angular provide a jQuery-like syntax for doing so. So I'm going to say element.bind, and we're going to bind to a click event, and then call a function. When that element's clicked and the function runs, what we want to do is run the JavaScript contained in this click directive. We're going to use scope eval to evaluate the contents of the click attribute against the scope of the controller, in this case the example controller. Then we're going to grab the attribute out of the attrs object. So I'm going to say attrs.click. I know it's .click because it's the name of our directive, because in order to use this directive we need to add the click attribute. Just to show you what I mean, I'm going to console log the attribute object. If I open up my developer tools and clear the console and then refresh the page, you can see we get this EA object. This is a list of attributes, and you can see we have the click attribute with the string that we got from the attribute here. We're going to evaluate this using Angular's special eval method. So now, hopefully, when I click the button, we will get the scope message alerted out to us. And you can see we do. So there we've created our own version of the ng-click directive. Next, let's take it a bit further and make our own element. I'll just close the dev tools. So the first thing we need to do is change the restrict. I'm going to make this E so we can create an element, and our element is going to be called a clicker, so I'm going to change the name of the directive. Now instead of using a button, I'll make it a clicker, and then but leave the click attribute on there because we still want to be able to define what it is we want to happen when the button's clicked. You notice that we no longer have a button, but we're going to use the directive template to turn this clicker into a button. Next I'm going to define our template. So it's going to be a button, And I'll close off that button and then fix my JavaScript. And you can see now we have a button, and our message and clicker element have completely disappeared. But this isn't ideal, because if you're creating a reusable component like this clicker, you want to be able to pass templating data into it to have that exist inside the element you're creating. So in this case, we want the message to appear inside the button. In Angular, this is called transclusion. The first thing we have to do is include the ng transclude directive on the button, and then tell Angular that we want to allow transclusion, and also that we want to replace this element. So I'm going to say replace is true, and transclude is true. And now you can see that the message that's set in our example controller appears inside a button, but we've never set up a button here. It's being transformed by our directive, by our clicker directive. And it's being transcluded in, which means that the content of our original clicker element is being copied inside the directive that we've set up a template on. If I remove ng transclude from here, you can see that the content is not copied in, because we haven't told Angular that we want to be able to transclude data in. Transclusion is a complicated topic, and I'd recommend reading the Angular directive guide on it. And now when I click the button, you can see we are getting our hello message again, because I've still got the same event handler going on and it's still evaluating the same attribute. I can update this attribute and call it onClick, and Angular will again normalize this, so I'm still logging the attributes. If we look at the most recent, the EA object, you can see that it's normalized the onClick attribute to be camel cased. So I can update this to be onClick. Click the button and we get our hello message. To show you the same is true of the transformation of directive names, I'm going to rename our directive to myClicker. You can see I've used the camel case example here, but I'm going to use a dash example in the element here, so my-clicker, and I'll copy that over to the end of the element too. But you can see when I click it, it still works. Angular is transforming the my-clicker name, and this could also be my::clicker, and it would still work. Angular is transforming these to match them up against myClicker, so it's possible to build elements that might validate if you wanted to put it in a validator. In this case, this wouldn't validate, but there are other examples of combinations of values that are transformed to the camel case version that would validate. So now we've created our own directive. There's a whole lot more you can do with directives, and I haven't covered the compile step, but definitely do read the guide on AngularJS.org for more.